Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. We often think that our decisions will always be right, that we can avoid temptations and stay on the right path. But sometimes life confronts us with challenges that reveal our darkest and most hidden desires. This is a story about how I got caught in a whirlwind of passion that tore my principles apart. I don't know what you would have done in my place, but I did what I did. And now, I want to tell you how it happened. My name is Sarah, and I always believed that one could adhere to clear moral principles in life. To me, love meant loyalty, faithfulness, and confidence in one's partner. Tom was just that kind of man, calm, predictable, and reliable. We had been dating for 2 years, and during that time, we hadn't had a single serious argument. Everything was going smoothly, and I was certain that our relationship perfectly matched my idea of happiness. That summer, we decided to spend some time apart. Tom wanted to go fishing with friends, and I decided to visit my father at his country house near San Diego. He was a successful businessman who spent most of his time traveling, and I wanted to spend some time with him, which we often lacked. My father's house is a spacious, bright place with a view of the ocean, where everything breathes peace and prosperity. When I arrived, my father welcomed me with open arms, clearly happy for my company. This time, he wasn't alone. Jack, his longtime friend and business partner, was with us. Jack was a man in his mid-40s, stately, with a pronounced charisma and a piercing gaze. I had seen him at a few family events before, but I had never paid much attention to him. However, this time, something changed. The three of us spent several days together, and gradually, I began to notice that Jack was attracting me more and more. He was a completely different person compared to Tom. Jack possessed that very confident maturity that was impossible to resist. He talked with my father about business, his numerous travels, and life in general. I watched him and felt a spark of interest ignite within me, one that I couldn't explain. One evening, my father suggested sitting on the veranda, enjoying the warm summer air, and spending time with a good glass of wine. Jack gladly supported the idea, and soon the three of us were sitting in cozy chairs, admiring the sunset. I rarely drank wine, but this time I decided to make an exception. The conversation flowed easily. My father told stories from his childhood, and Jack, as always, skillfully kept the conversation going, adding his witty remarks and comments. With every sip of wine, with every word from Jack, I felt an invisible connection forming between us. His voice was soft but confident, his eyes attentive and insightful. I began catching his glances, lingering on me just a bit longer than usual. Every time our eyes met, a strange, inexplicable excitement started to build inside me. My father, tired after a long day, soon went to bed, leaving Jack and me alone on the veranda. Once alone, I felt the tension between us intensify. Jack offered more wine, and feeling that I was losing control, I agreed. We talked about many things, yet at the same time, about nothing specific. Each of our exchanges was like a dance, graceful but full of hidden passion. When Jack suddenly moved closer to me, I felt his presence so acutely that my heart started beating faster. He didn't say a word, but in his eyes, I saw what I feared yet desired at the same time. His hand slightly touched mine, and I shuddered from that fleeting touch, as if struck by lightning. That touch ignited a fire within me that I had kept under control for so long. My morals, my principles, began to melt like ice under the scorching sun. I understood that this was wrong, that I should stop before I went too far. But when Jack leaned in close, his face so near that I could feel his breath, my thoughts disappeared. I couldn't resist the moment. Our lips met, and it was more than just a kiss. It was something greater. It was the forbidden fruit I had avoided for so long, but now couldn't refuse. That kiss was filled with a passion I had never experienced with Tom. I knew I was doing something terrible, but I couldn't stop. Jack held me as if I were his only salvation in this world, and in that moment, I felt like I wanted nothing else. It was the first step into the abyss I had been approaching for so long. When we pulled away from each other, I realized that the world around me had changed. Nothing was the same. Jack looked at me with the same fire in his eyes, and I knew that this was only the beginning. Inside, a storm was raging, and I didn't know how to stop this hurricane. But one thing I understood for sure: I could no longer resist what I was feeling. The next day after that kiss, I woke up with a sense of anxiety weighing heavily on my chest. The whole night passed in a fog. My dreams, usually so vivid, were blurry and unsettling this time. I tried to calm myself, convincing that everything that happened the night before was just a moment of weakness, a spark that wouldn't grow into a fire. But inside, doubts raged. In the morning, I saw that my father and Jack were already sitting in the kitchen, discussing some business matters. When I walked in, Jack glanced at me briefly, his gaze lingering just a second longer than it should have. It was such a fleeting moment that I might not have noticed it if not for the events of the previous day. But now, every gesture, every look of his seemed significant, full of meaning that only I could understand. At breakfast, I tried to avoid his gaze, focusing on the conversation with my father. He talked about his plans for the coming days, suggesting we take a trip to the city to see the local sights together. My father looked calm and content, as if he suspected nothing. Jack, for his part, acted as though nothing had happened, but I knew that wasn't the case. Our kiss had changed something inside me, and I couldn't simply forget it, no matter how hard I tried. After breakfast, my father suggested we take a walk along the shore. We gladly agreed. The air was fresh, filled with the salty notes of the ocean, and the sun, not yet too high in the sky, warmed my back with pleasant heat. I walked slightly ahead, trying to focus on the beauty of the surrounding nature, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Jack. He walked behind, and I felt his presence like something tangible, pressing on me. When we returned home, my father said he had a few business calls to make, leaving Jack and me alone. I didn't know how to behave. I tried to occupy myself with something, moving to another room, but my thoughts constantly returned to what had happened. Inside me, two feelings were battling, fear and desire. I knew I should have stopped, but I was powerless to do so. Jack apparently felt the tension too. He offered to help him with something in the backyard. Agreeing, I realized I was trapped. I couldn't refuse, but staying alone with him seemed dangerous. We worked in silence, trying not to meet each other's eyes, but the tension between us grew with each passing minute. At some point, I accidentally turned around and saw that Jack was looking at me. In his eyes was the same fire I had seen the day before. I felt a wave of heat wash over me. He stepped closer, too close. I wanted to step back, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground. He took my hand, and at that moment, I realized that everything was already out of control. My feelings, my mind, my moral principles. Everything was overwhelmed by this sudden, fierce desire. "We shouldn't," I began, but he didn't let me finish. His lips were on mine again, and I could no longer resist. This time, it was even stronger, even more intense. We stood in the middle of the garden, surrounded by greenery and the scent of flowers, but all I felt was him. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I drowned in that kiss, forgetting everything. When we finally broke apart, I was breathing heavily, trying to regain control of myself, but it was useless. I knew that this moment had become a point of no return. Now I understood that our relationship with Jack was not just a random impulse. There was a connection between us that I couldn't ignore, and I didn't know where it would lead us. That day, I barely spoke to my father. The whole time I spent with him, I felt like a traitor, even though he suspected nothing. I was trapped by my own feelings and didn't know how to find a way out. Jack also tried to avoid me, but in his eyes, I saw the same thing I felt, a desire we couldn't fight. In the evening, when I was alone in my room, I tried to figure out what to do next. My thoughts were tangled, my emotions heightened to the limit. I knew I should have told Tom, but I couldn't. It was too complicated, too painful. I didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time, I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. The next day, my father said that he had an opportunity to leave for a couple of days on business and suggested I stay in the house with Jack. I understood that this was dangerous, but at the same time, it was a chance to sort out my feelings, to understand what I really wanted. And I agreed, even though I knew it could lead to unpredictable consequences. My father left early in the morning, leaving behind only the faint scent of his usual cologne and a feeling of emptiness in the house. I stood by the window, watching as his car disappeared around the corner, realizing that I was now alone with Jack. A sense of unease crept into my soul again, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of excitement that surged with renewed force. I couldn't understand what frightened me more: the fact that I couldn't resist my feelings, or that I didn't want to. Jack met me in the kitchen. He was calm, as always, but there was something new in his eyes, something deeper than just friendliness. It was the look of a man who knew what had transpired between us and understood that we could no longer go back. "It seems we have a few days to ourselves," he said, smiling at me as if nothing special had happened between us. "Yes," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed my nervousness. "What do you plan to do?" "Maybe we should just relax and enjoy the time? Your father will be back in a couple of days, and then everything will return to normal." His words sounded simple, but there was something more in them that I couldn't quite grasp. We both knew that this time we had meant much more than just a break. It was a time to understand what was really happening between us and decide where it would lead. We spent the morning doing ordinary things: breakfast, a walk through the garden, talking about matters unrelated to our feelings. Everything seemed as if we were trying to behave as usual, but the tension between us grew with every passing minute. I couldn't concentrate on the conversations. My thoughts kept returning to our last kiss, to how his hands held me, how his lips touched mine. After lunch, Jack suggested going into town to buy groceries and get some fresh air. I agreed, though I knew it was just an excuse to escape the tension that had built up in the house. We drove along scenic roads lined with green hills, but even that view couldn't distract me from thoughts of what lay ahead. In town, we went through the stores, bought everything we needed, and stopped for coffee at a small, cozy cafe. Jack sat across from me, his gaze calm, but I saw in his eyes the same struggle that was happening inside me. We talked about life, about our plans for the future, but these conversations felt empty. They couldn't fill the void that had formed between us. When we returned home, I felt that something had changed. The house seemed quieter than usual, and that silence weighed on us. I went into my room and sat on the bed, trying to sort out my feelings. I knew Jack felt the same: that tension, that strange mix of fear and desire that wouldn't let us go. I tried to distract myself, to read a book or watch a movie, but nothing helped. Inside me, anxiety grew, a desire to see Jack, to talk to him, to understand what we were going to do next. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore and went out to the terrace. There I found him. He was standing, leaning against the railing, watching the sunset. I approached him, and he turned to me, his gaze just like the moment when he first kissed me. I knew I couldn't leave without talking to him. "Jack, what are we doing?" My voice was tense, but I couldn't hide my excitement. "Sarah, I don't know," he sighed, his voice quiet but full of the same emotions that were churning inside me. "I didn't want this to go so far, but now, I just can't stop." Those words echoed in my heart. I stepped closer, feeling that spark between us reigniting, the one we had tried to ignore. He made no move to stop me, and that was the only answer I needed. I placed my hand on his shoulder, and he took my hand in his. We stood there for several minutes, not saying a word. The moment was filled with a quiet yet unbearable tension. Finally, Jack pulled me towards him, and I found myself in his arms. His lips found mine again, and I felt everything that had been holding me back shatter into pieces. This kiss was not just full of passion, but also pain, the realization that we were doing something wrong, but couldn't stop. I felt my arms wrap around his neck, his body pressed against mine, and the sensation was both sweet and bitter. When we broke apart, I saw in his eyes a reflection of my own feelings. We both knew this wasn't just physical attraction. It was something more that drew us to each other, leaving no chance to turn back. The evening turned into night, and we stayed on the terrace, holding each other and silently watching the stars. It was the calm before the storm, a moment when everything seemed possible, yet at the same time, impossible. We both knew the future was uncertain, that difficult decisions awaited us. But right now, in this moment, we were together, and that was the only thing that mattered. I woke up to a barely perceptible touch. The room was in semi-darkness, with the morning sun just beginning to break through the curtains, bathing the bedroom in a soft light. I struggled to open my eyes, and saw him. Jack was standing next to my bed, his gaze filled with the same untamed passion as the night before. He seemed so calm, so self-assured, that for a moment I lost my sense of reality. My heart skipped a beat as I felt his hand gently touch my face. It was such a tender, almost weightless touch, but it ignited a storm of emotions within me. Jack leaned closer, his breath brushing my skin, and at that moment, I realized that we could no longer stop. He kissed me, at first softly, almost cautiously, but then his kiss grew deeper, more demanding. I felt everything inside me come alive in response to his touch. This kiss wasn't just a physical act, it was filled with everything we had been trying to hide from each other. I felt his hand move to my neck, then to my shoulder, slowly sliding down, sending shivers across my body. I could no longer resist. My body responded to his actions, and I felt my hands reach out to him, embracing him, pulling him closer. Jack continued to kiss me, his lips slowly gliding over my face and neck, and each kiss made me forget about the world around me. I could think of nothing but him. Everything happened so naturally, as if our bodies knew what to do without needing instructions. He was insistent, yet very attentive, his touches confident but gentle. When he pulled the blanket off me, I felt a wave of heat engulf me. His hands explored my body, and every movement of his kindled even more desire within me. I closed my eyes and surrendered completely to the moment, allowing myself to forget about everything in the world. Jack pressed against me, and I felt his warmth, his strength. This moment was so real that I couldn't believe it was actually happening. We became one, and I felt our breathing synchronize, his movements making my body respond with the same passion. His hands glided over my body, as if studying every part of it. It was like a dance, full of passion and desires we had suppressed for so long. I was drowning in his touches, his kisses. Jack was everywhere, his hands, his lips, his breath. I felt everything inside me tremble, and everything I thought about myself and my principles simply disappeared under the pressure of this passion. His movements grew more insistent, and I responded with equal intensity. My body and mind stopped resisting. We were consumed by each other. Every move he made was like a burst of fire, penetrating deep into my being, burning away everything that was left of my former self. We continued this dance, forgetting about everything except each other, forgetting about time and place. At this moment, we were free from everything. From the world, from rules, from prohibitions. We were just a man and a woman who had finally found each other. When it was over, I lay in his arms, feeling his breath slowly return to normal. I was completely exhausted, but at the same time filled with something new, something I had never experienced before. It wasn't just physical satisfaction, it was the feeling that I had found something important, something that had changed me forever. Jack hugged me tighter, his hand gently stroking my back, and in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. We lay silently, savoring a moment that seemed to last an eternity. This day changed everything. Now we were connected, not just physically, but emotionally, and I didn't know where this path would lead us. As I closed my eyes, I knew that tomorrow we would have to make many difficult decisions. But at that moment, all of it seemed distant and unimportant. We were here and now, and that was the only thing that mattered. The morning came unexpectedly. The first rays of the sun gently touched my face, slipping through the partially drawn curtains. I opened my eyes and realized I was lying in Jack's arms. Everything that had happened last night seemed unreal to me, but his warmth, his breath beside me, reminded me that it wasn't a dream. We had truly crossed the line I had been so afraid to cross. I carefully pulled away, trying not to wake him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts swirled in my head like a whirlwind. I knew I had to think about what would happen next, but I couldn't focus. Inside me, conflicting feelings raged. On the one hand, I felt complete satisfaction and a strange joy about what had happened. But on the other hand, guilt and fear flooded me as soon as I started thinking about Tom and what would happen if my father found out. Jack woke up, sensing my movement. He opened his eyes and looked at me with the same tenderness I had seen the day before. His gaze was warm, without a hint of doubt or regret. I knew he felt the same as I did, but he didn't seem afraid. Maybe he was just better at hiding his emotions, or maybe he was truly confident in what he was doing. "Good morning." His voice was low, a little hoarse from sleep, but still just as gentle. "Good morning," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over my face, but Jack just smiled, pulling me closer. "Sarah, do you regret anything?" he asked softly, his gaze full of tenderness and perhaps a hint of concern. I held my breath for a moment, considering his question. Do I regret it? This question had been tormenting me since the very second I woke up. I knew I shouldn't have let this happen, knew it was a betrayal of Tom and my father. But at the same time, when I remembered the night spent with Jack, I couldn't deny that I had never felt more alive. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I'm confused, Jack. I don't know what to do next." He looked at me with understanding. His hand gently slid across my cheek as if he was trying to erase all my doubts. "We'll figure it out," he said confidently. "We need time to think it all over." I nodded, but something inside me was restless. Time was what I feared most right now. I knew that the longer we waited, the harder it would be to make a decision. But I also couldn't imagine ending everything that had developed between us. It was too strong, too important to me. We spent the morning together, talking about everyday things, trying not to touch on what had happened between us. But the tension hung in the air, and I couldn't ignore it. Jack suggested we take a walk along the coast to clear our minds, and I agreed, hoping that the fresh air and the sound of the ocean would help me calm down a bit. We walked along the beach, the wind blowing through my hair, and the waves gently touched my feet. Jack walked beside me, his presence both soothing and exciting. I felt his hand reach for mine again, and at that moment, I realized that I couldn't just let him go. The connection between us was too strong to ignore. When we stopped at the water's edge, I turned to him. His gaze was serious, filled with the same internal struggle I saw in myself. I couldn't help but pull him closer, feeling his lips touch mine again. This kiss was just as passionate as before, but now there was something new in it, a mixture of tenderness and desperation. We stood there, forgetting about everything but the two of us. At that moment, I realized that our connection had become something more than just a fleeting infatuation. I couldn't deny that I loved Jack, and that scared me even more. I knew that sooner or later we would have to make a choice, but for now, I wanted to stay in this moment, savoring every second of it. When we returned home, I felt that something had changed in our house. It was something intangible but palpable. Now this place carried memories of our moments together, of our secrets, and I knew I could never look at it the same way again. In the evening, I was alone in my room again, pondering everything that had happened. I couldn't find answers to my questions, couldn't decide what to do next. But I knew one thing. Jack had become a part of my life, and I couldn't imagine it without him. I understood that this was just the calm before the storm, that soon everything would change when my father returned, when I faced Tom. But for now, I was ready to enjoy this moment, this strange but so important time for me. In the morning, I woke up alone again. Jack had already left, leaving a light scent of his cologne on my pillow. I ran my hand over the place where he had lain and felt a strange emptiness. It seemed that the whole house, filled with memories of our time together, now pressed down on me with its silence and loneliness. I didn't know how long I could endure it. I got out of bed and stepped outside. The ocean breeze was fresh, and I tried to inhale it deeply, hoping it would dispel my worries. But every thought returned to Jack. I could no longer live in this tension, but at the same time, I couldn't imagine how it would all end. My life had suddenly turned into a complicated tangle of feelings, desires, and guilt, and I didn't know how to unravel it. When I returned to the house, Jack was in the kitchen, making breakfast. He looked so calm, so ordinary, that for a moment I wanted to believe it had all been just a dream. But his eyes, when they met mine, told me everything I needed to know. Between us, there was still this connection, invisible but strong, like a thin thread stretched between two hearts. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "Good morning," I replied, trying to remain as calm as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. We had breakfast together, chatting about trivial things, trying to avoid deeper topics. But the tension hung in the air like a fog enveloping us both. I felt as if we were on the edge of something dangerous, but I couldn't stop. Around noon, we heard the sound of a car approaching. I tensed, realizing it could only be one person, my father. My heart started pounding faster, and I felt my palms get sweaty. Jack looked at me. His face remained calm, but in his eyes, I saw a shadow of worry. "Sarah, it will be okay," he said, trying to reassure me. But I knew that after his return, nothing would be okay. We could no longer pretend everything was as it was before. My father entered the house, his steps confident as always. He smiled when he saw me and gave me a tight hug. I felt like it was hard to breathe, my heart pounding like crazy. But I forced myself to smile back, hoping he wouldn't notice anything. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you? How was your time?" His voice was full of joy, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for hiding the truth from him. "I'm good, Dad. Jack and I had a great time. How about you?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation to safer grounds. Dad began to talk about his trip, how the meetings went, how things were going at his company. Jack joined the conversation, and it seemed like the most ordinary day. But inside me, a storm was raging. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to collapse. In the evening, Dad suggested we have dinner at a restaurant in town to celebrate his return. I couldn't refuse, though I felt it was getting harder and harder to keep myself together with every passing hour. I knew our little world that Jack and I had created over the past few days was about to crumble under the pressure of reality. We went to the restaurant, and the whole evening seemed to pass in tense silence, although conversations and laughter filled the air. I could barely eat, each bite stuck in my throat. Jack behaved as usual. He was courteous and sociable, but I could see he was also tense. Every glance, every gesture was filled with what we couldn't say out loud. When we returned home, I felt exhausted. Dad wished us a good night and went to his room, leaving us alone. Jack approached me, and his touch was like a breath of fresh air after a long submersion underwater. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said quietly, but I already knew what the conversation would be about. "I know," I replied, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "But what do we do? How do we move forward?" He looked at me with the same tenderness as before. His hand touched my cheek, and I felt all my barriers collapsing again. "I don't know, but we'll find a way." His voice was full of confidence, but I saw he was struggling with it himself. We stood like that for a few minutes, then he leaned in and kissed me. This kiss was unlike the previous ones. It was filled with sadness and fear of what awaited us. I responded to his kiss, feeling all my emotions mingling in that moment. When we finally broke apart, I realized I could no longer run from the truth. Everything that had happened between us now required a decision, and I knew that soon we would have to make a choice that would change our lives forever. A week had passed since my father's return, and during that time, I felt as if I were living in a fog. Jack and I hadn't spoken about what had happened, but it lingered in the air like a dark cloud ready to burst at any moment. I sensed that we were both on edge, but neither of us dared to take the first step. My father seemed unaware. He was busy with his own affairs, discussing various business matters with Jack, while I tried to pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew this couldn't go on for long. One evening, my father suggested that I return to the city for a while to change the scenery and get some rest. I understood that this was his way of suggesting I take a break, but the very thought of leaving sent me into a panic. I shared my thoughts with Jack, and he agreed with my father. He said that separation might help us both sort out our feelings, but I could see it was as hard for him as it was for me. Finally, I agreed. We decided that I would go away for a few weeks to be alone and think things over. On the day of departure, I felt shattered. I packed my things, and after saying goodbye to my father, went to find Jack. He was in the garden, standing at the edge of the cliff, looking out at the ocean. I approached him, and he turned to me, his gaze full of the same pain as mine. "Are you sure you want to leave?" he asked, his voice quiet, but I heard the concern in it. "No," I answered honestly, "but I think it's something we need to do, for both of us." He nodded in agreement, but I saw his hands clench into fists. I moved closer and hugged him, feeling his body tense with emotion. We stood there for several minutes, just savoring the closeness that might be our last for a long time. "I'll miss you," I whispered, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. "I will too, Sarah." His voice trembled, but he tried to hold it together. "But maybe this will help us figure out what we really want." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream that I didn't want to leave, that I wanted to stay with him, but I understood that wasn't the answer. We were both too confused by our feelings, and maybe separation could indeed help. "Promise you'll write to me," I said, trying to hold back tears. "I promise," he replied, gently touching my face. "We'll stay in touch, I promise." I kissed him one last time before leaving. The kiss was filled with sadness, but also with hope that our connection would endure the test of time and distance. When we finally broke apart, I felt as if a part of me stayed with him on that shore, where we had shared so many emotions. When I returned home to the house I shared with Tom, I felt an odd sense of emptiness. This place had once seemed cozy, a safe haven, but now it felt foreign. My life before visiting my father seemed distant and strange. I thought coming back here would bring clarity, but instead, I found myself even more confused. Tom greeted me with warmth and joy. He hugged me as if not noticing that I had changed. I tried to pretend everything was fine, but each time he touched me, I felt something inside me break. All my confidence that I could return to my old life vanished the moment I stepped through the door of our home. "I missed you so much, Sarah," he said, holding me tighter than usual. "I'm so glad you're back." "I missed you too," I replied, but there was a false note in my voice that I couldn't hide. The whole evening, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. We had dinner together, talked about his trip, about what I did at my father's, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Jack. I couldn't stop thinking that maybe he was thinking about me now, writing me a message I would only see later that night. When we finally went to bed, I felt tension building in my body. Tom embraced me, and I tried to relax, but instead, panic began to rise inside me. I realized I could no longer live a double life, that I needed to make a choice, but that choice seemed impossible. A few days passed, and I realized I couldn't continue living this way. I went out with Tom, we took walks, had meals together, but every time he looked at me, I felt guilty. Every time he said he loved me, that he was glad I was back, I wanted to scream that everything wasn't as it seemed. Jack wrote to me every day, and his messages were my only solace. He asked how I was, said he missed me, that he hoped to see me soon. Those words warmed my heart, but also made me feel worse. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, that something had to change, but I didn't know how. One evening, when Tom went out to meet friends, I stayed alone in our apartment. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, but my thoughts kept returning to Jack. I took out my phone and read his latest message. "Sarah, I understand things are tough for you right now, but I want you to know that I'll always be there for you, no matter what you decide." Those words hit me like lightning. I knew I had to make a choice, and it was inevitable. I couldn't keep dragging this out. I couldn't keep living with Tom, pretending everything was fine when my heart belonged to someone else. I got up from the table, feeling determination growing inside me. I needed to talk to Tom, to tell him the truth. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I couldn't keep running from reality. When Tom returned, I was waiting for him in the living room. He came in smiling, but when he saw the expression on my face, his smile faded. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, looking at me with concern. I couldn't hold back the tears. "Tom, we need to talk." He sat opposite me, and I told him everything. About Jack, about what happened at my father's, about how I couldn't stay with him pretending nothing had changed. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but I knew I had to be honest with him and myself. Tom listened silently, his face growing darker with each of my words. When I finished, he didn't respond for a long time, his eyes full of pain. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he finally asked, his voice full of disappointment and hurt. "I was scared, Tom, scared of hurting you, scared of admitting to myself that everything had changed. I didn't want to lose you, but I realize I already have." He was silent for a while longer, then got up and left the room. I sat there, feeling my world crumble. I knew it was necessary, but that didn't make the pain any less sharp. Tom left the house for a few hours. When he returned, he said he needed time to think and suggested I stay with a friend or at my parents' for a while to give him space. I agreed. It was fair. I packed my things and left, leaving behind everything we once shared. Now I was at a crossroads. Jack was there, but I still didn't know what to do next. I needed time to figure out where to go and what I really wanted. Jack and I stayed in touch, and I knew the moment would come soon when we would need to meet and talk about everything. I went to stay with my friend, and now my life seemed like one big uncertainty. I knew that difficult decisions awaited me, but I was ready to make them because I could no longer live a lie. A few days had passed since I left the home I shared with Tom. I was staying with my friend Kate, who understood my situation and offered me a temporary refuge. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, knowing I wasn't ready to talk about it. I was grateful to her for that. I needed time to think things over and was trying to piece my thoughts together. Tom hadn't called or written, and I understood that this was his way of coming to terms with what had happened. I knew I had hurt him and expected he might never forgive me. But as hard as it was for me, I knew that everything that happened was inevitable. We couldn't continue living a lie, and I was ready to face the consequences of my actions. One evening, as I sat in Kate's room, pondering my life, my phone rang. It was Tom. I knew this conversation would be difficult, but I couldn't avoid it any longer. I picked up the phone, trying to brace myself for what he might say. "Sarah." His voice was quiet and serious, lacking the warmth I was used to. "Hi, Tom," I replied, feeling a tight knot of tension in my chest. "We need to meet," he said, without any unnecessary introductions. "I want to talk in person." I agreed. We arranged to meet at a cafe we used to frequent. A place that once held so many happy moments now felt foreign and cold to me. When I arrived at the cafe, Tom was already waiting for me at a table in the corner. He looked tired and troubled, as if he had aged significantly over the past few days. I sat down opposite him, trying to remain calm, even though a storm of emotions was raging inside me. "Thank you for coming," he began, avoiding my gaze. "I've thought a lot about this, and I need to tell you how I feel." I nodded, signaling that I was ready to listen. "Sarah, I love you, and I probably always will. But what happened? I can't cope with it. It changed everything between us, and I understand that I can't continue living, pretending nothing happened." He paused, and I felt my heart clench at his words. "I thought I could get over it, that I could forgive you. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that it won't work. I know we had good times, but now they seem distant and unreal. Every time I think of you, I remember what happened, and it tears me apart." I couldn't hold back my tears. I knew he was right. I knew it was impossible to simply forget about it and continue living as before. "Tom, I understand," I said through my tears. "I understand that my decision ruined everything, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I sincerely regret what I did." He finally met my gaze, his eyes full of pain, but also determination. "Sarah, it's not just about forgiveness. It's about the fact that I can't continue a relationship with someone who cheated on me. It destroyed our trust, our bond, and I don't want to live in constant fear that it might happen again. Such a relationship cannot be healthy. It's not a life, it's torture." I nodded, feeling his words hit directly at my heart. I knew he was right. I knew I had destroyed not only our relationship, but also his trust in me. "I don't want to live in the past anymore," Tom continued, his voice firm but quiet. "I want to move on, find someone who can be faithful to me and with whom I can build a healthy relationship. I hope you find your way and be happy too, but I can't be a part of it anymore." Those words felt like a final blow. I knew this was the end, and I had to accept it. Despite the pain, I understood that this was necessary. "Thank you for being honest with me," I said, trying to hold myself together, even though everything inside me screamed in pain. "I want you to know that I sincerely wish you happiness." He nodded slightly, his gaze softening, but it still held sadness. We sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then he stood up. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said, and in his voice, I heard something resembling forgiveness, but not the kind that would bring us back. It was a forgiveness that allowed us to move on. "And you, Tom," I replied, unable to find any other words. He left, and I was alone in the cafe, feeling my heart shatter completely. But at the same time, I felt a sense of relief. Now I knew it was time to move on, that this chapter of my life had ended. I stepped outside and breathed in the cool evening air. The world continued to turn despite my pain, and I knew that new challenges and decisions awaited me ahead, but now I was ready for them. I knew that my journey with Tom was over, and although it was painful, it was the right thing. Now I could focus on what lay ahead, and one of those things was Jack. After Tom left the cafe, I stayed there for a long time, pondering his words. Our conversation left a deep wound in me, but it also brought a sense of relief. Everything was final, and now I needed to move forward. I knew that returning to my old life was pointless. I had to find a new path, and part of that path was inevitably connected with Jack. Back at my friend's place, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts about what had happened mingled with images of the future that I couldn't yet clearly envision. I understood that I now had the opportunity to start over, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. The next morning, I decided to contact Jack. I picked up my phone and sent a short message. "Hi Jack, I need to talk to you." I didn't know what to expect, but I knew this meeting would be crucial. His response came quickly. "Of course, Sarah. When is convenient for you? We can meet at my place." I felt my heart race. His invitation to meet at his house evoked mixed feelings of excitement and relief. I knew this meeting would be different from all our previous conversations, and it would determine our future. We agreed to meet the next day. I spent the rest of the day reflecting, trying to understand what I felt. My relationship with Jack was complex and full of contradictions. On one hand, I loved him, and that feeling hadn't faded since we broke up. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the guilt and fear of what might happen next. The next day, I headed to his place. The whole way there, I felt the tension building inside me. I tried to calm myself, but thoughts of Tom still lingered. I understood that this step would mean the beginning of something new, but I was also afraid it might be a mistake. When I arrived at Jack's house, my heart started beating faster again. The place was familiar to me, but now it seemed strange and intimidating. I got out of the car and headed to the door, feeling each step grow heavier. Jack met me at the door. He looked a bit concerned, but his face lit up with a smile when he saw me. "Sarah, I'm glad you came," he said, opening the door and inviting me in. I stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth and coziness of the house. Everything was as I remembered. Neat furnishings, subdued lighting, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. This place evoked mixed feelings. Memories of our past meetings filled with passion and forbidden closeness, and anxiety about what lay ahead. We went to the living room, and I sat on the sofa, feeling uncertain. Jack sat next to me, his gaze full of care and understanding. He could clearly sense that I was troubled. "Sarah, what's happened?" he asked, his voice gentle but with a note of concern. I sighed, gathering my thoughts. "Tom and we broke up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jack frowned, his eyes showing sympathy. "I thought this might happen. Sarah, I'm so sorry you're going through this. How are you feeling?" "Honestly, I don't know," I replied, feeling tears start to form. "It hurts, but I understand it was the right thing to do. I couldn't keep living a lie." Jack took my hand, his touch gentle but reassuring. "You were brave, Sarah. It's not easy to make such a decision, but sometimes it's the only path to freedom." I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw the same genuine care I had always felt. But I also saw something more, a desire to understand what we would do next. "Jack," I began, feeling that the moment had come to say everything I had been holding back. "I don't know what's next. I'm not sure I'm ready for something new, but I can't deny what I feel for you." He gently squeezed my hand, his gaze becoming more serious. "Sarah, I understand that everything seems uncertain right now. I won't pressure you, but I want you to know, I'm here for you. Whatever you decide, I'll be by your side." His words brought me a sense of calm, but also anxiety. I knew Jack was sincere, but I also understood that we needed to sort out our feelings before taking the next step. "I want to spend time with you," I finally decided. "I need to understand what's next, and I don't want to rush." Jack smiled, his gaze softening. "Of course, Sarah. We can start small. You can stay here for a couple of days if you want. No obligations, just to be together." I felt relieved. His suggestion seemed reasonable, giving us time and space to sort out our feelings. I nodded in agreement, and Jack put his arm around me, pulling me closer. This embrace was full of the warmth and support I had been missing lately. I felt the icy tension inside me start to melt, and I was finally able to relax. We spent the evening together, talking about various things: life, our feelings, what lay ahead. We made no hasty decisions, no promises, but both knew this was the first step towards something new. When night fell over the city, I realized I was ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. I was with Jack, and although our relationship was full of uncertainty, I felt it was exactly what I needed right now. We didn't know what awaited us, but we were ready to move forward together. Several weeks have passed since I accepted Jack's offer to stay with him for a couple of days. Those few days turned into weeks, and I gradually realized that there was no going back for me. Tom and I had officially broken up, and now my life was intertwined with Jack's. The first days were not easy. We both felt a little uncertain, as if walking on thin ice, unsure if it would hold us. I was afraid that our relationship, built on passion and forbidden feelings, might not withstand the test of time and reality. But despite all my fears, I knew I wanted to be with him. Jack proved to be patient and understanding. He didn't pressure me or demand immediate decisions. We lived together, got to know each other anew, and discovered new sides of our characters and relationship. I saw in him not only a passionate lover, but also a person who was ready to support me in whatever happened. Every morning, I woke up in his arms, and this moment became a symbol of a new beginning for me. Jack was there, and I felt I could be myself without hiding my fears and insecurities. We spent our days together, enjoying the little things: walks on the beach, breakfasts on the terrace, quiet evenings by the fireplace. Of course, not everything was perfect. Sometimes doubts and guilt overwhelmed me for destroying my previous relationship. I knew that my actions had hurt other people, and it left a scar on my soul that would probably never fully heal. But Jack was always there, reminding me that we had made a choice and needed to move forward despite everything. We decided that we would live together. This decision didn't come immediately, but when we both realized we didn't want to be apart anymore, it became natural. Our home became a place where I could find peace and comfort, where we could build our life on new beginnings. I realized that real relationships require more than just passion. They require trust, patience, and a willingness to go through difficulties together. Jack and I began to build this relationship step by step, and although I knew new challenges awaited us, I felt ready to face them with him. Looking back at everything that happened, I can't help but admit that I made mistakes. I acted terribly, betraying the trust of a person who loved me. My decisions led to destruction, and I wouldn't advise anyone to follow my example. My path was full of pain and suffering, and I realize I could have acted differently. But it was my decision. I made my choice and must live with its consequences. The way back is closed, and now I can only move forward. There are no winners in this story, but there are lessons I learned for myself. Life is full of difficult choices, and sometimes we do things we can't even explain to ourselves. We follow our desires, make mistakes, and hurt others and ourselves. But despite all this, I realized that real life begins where we take responsibility for our actions and learn to live with them. I know my path is not perfect, but it's mine, and I'm ready to keep going, understanding that every day is a new opportunity to make the right choice.